Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School, and we're very proud to host the Michael V. Hayden Center. With all that's happening these days in international security, fractured alliances, concerns about continued U.S. global leadership, there is really a need for forums such as these to provide informed analyses of the challenging issues of our times. And as many of you know, many Hayden Center regulars are here. We avoid the kind of overheated and hyper-partisan analyses that drive so much of the political narrative these days, and try to bring substantive and non-ideological perspectives to understanding complex public policy problems. The focus here is on the very complex issues of intelligence and security. And over the course of any academic calendar year, we have major policymakers, directors of federal agencies, leading analysts, scholars, among others, leading our forums. So thank you for attending this event. We had about 300 persons registered to attend here this evening, and 450 signed up to attend virtually. So another impressive turnout for a Hayden Center event. And at last look, we had registrations from people from 41 states in the District of Columbia, 17 countries and 5 continents. So very wide reach for our Hayden Center programs. Again, thank you for attending. Hope to see you at future events. And I now welcome the director of the Hayden Center, Larry Pfeiffer. Larry.
Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. First off, I want to apologize to those of you who had registered for this thing way back in February. Mother Nature affected us the first time with the snowfall, and then the second time had to delay the event because of a personal situation with my family that I had to attend to down in Florida. So I appreciate your patience and indulgence, and I'm glad you're here. And for those of you who are with us online, I'm glad you joined us today as well. The last couple of years, this has been a fun event. It's been well attended. It had its origins with a number of audience members complaining to me that there was never enough time at the end of our events to ask all the questions they wanted to ask. And I said to General Hayden, maybe we ought to at least once a year just do an event where it's just all questions. And so that's what we have done the last 2 years, and seems to have been pretty well received, and we get a lot of great questions, and we try to answer most of them. So, so we look forward tonight to you guys driving the agenda by asking questions. You can do that if you're in the audience here in person by standing in line at the 2 microphones that are at the ends of the aisles here. So begin thinking about the questions you want to ask. I'm going to do a little warm-up question to get everybody on stage warmed up and get you to build up the courage to go to the microphone. And then we hope to fill the rest of the hour plus with your questions. For those of you who are online watching on YouTube, we're going to monitor the live chat on YouTube. So please use the live chat function on YouTube, and we'll try to get to some of those YouTube questions as well. Tonight we have got, we've assembled a great group of Schar School and Hayden Center people. I will start to my immediate left here with General Michael V. Hayden. For those who don't know General Hayden, he had a legendary 40-plus year career serving in the U.S. military, the U.S. Air Force, and also as a civilian at the end. He served as the director of 2 of our largest intelligence agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. And he was also the very first principal deputy director of national intelligence at the stand-up of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the early 2000s. He has been a visiting professor here at the Schar School since 2009, and the founder of the Hayden Center beginning in 2017. That's hard to believe. So thank you, General Hayden, for joining us as always and giving us all the inspiration to do this. Next to General Hayden, we have Jennifer Victor. Jennifer is an associate professor of political science here at the Schar School. She is the director of the Democracy Lab academic community. Maybe there's some Democracy Lab folks in the audience. We've had some of them attend our events in the past. It's really been an exciting venture that I think has really excited a good group of students to look at our governance, look at our government, participate politically in this great nation that we have, and so I thank her for that. She, among other things, has received the Teaching Excellence Award at George Mason University in 2019. So, and I've heard nothing but the best thing from students about her classes. So if you've not signed up for a class, you may want to look to sign up for one of Jennifer's classes. Sitting next to Jennifer is Ellen Laipson. Ellen is a professor here at Schar School. She is the director of the International Security Program. She is the director of its Center for Security Policy Studies. She's a veteran of the intel community, had served most notably as vice chairman of the National Intelligence Council. She's also a veteran of the National Security Council at the White House, having served as a director for Middle East and North Africa, correct, Jim?
South Asia.
Thank you. And she led, before her time here at Schar School, led for several years the Stimson Center, really wonderful think tank down here, downtown Washington, D.C., and now serves as its president emeritus. And then last at the end of the row here, but not least, is Greg Coblence. He's an associate professor here at Schar School. He directs the Biodefense Graduate Program. He is the editor-in-chief of something called the Pandora Report. The name itself should intrigue you to go Google it and look it and read it. It's a lot of really interesting work on biodefense, biosecurity, pandemic-related information, biotechnology, and fascinating material to read. He also serves as a co-director of something called the Global Labs Initiative. So if you have any questions about any laboratories around the world and how safe they are or are not, he's the guy to ask. You may not want to hear the answer. And then there's me. I'm the director of the Hayden Center. I've been doing this since 2017. And before that, I served 32 years in the intel community, 20 years at NSA. Most of the rest of the time was at CIA, although I did the year stand-up with General Hayden at the ODNI, and I did serve a couple of years at the White House, managing the White House Situation Room on a detail from CIA. I do consulting and some other things that probably would bore you if I went on and on. So while you all are thinking about questions and starting to work your way down your rows to get in line for the microphones so that I'm not the guy asking all the questions tonight, let me begin by asking General Hayden, as I have done at the last couple of these events, what would you say is the number one national security concern that keeps you up at night?
Wow. There's a lot, there really is a lot going on. In 1 week, you know about what happened in the Oval Office on Friday, right? And then the Secretary of Defense called a halt to cyber operations in Russia. And then the CIA director said, we'll pause to do things for Ukraine. And then the White House 2 days ago said we were stopping arms in Ukraine. And then people were saying, wow, I don't know, there's something going on in the United States. I'm worried about our friends and maybe also the Israelis and the Saudis and so on. Okay, we'll meet with you, but I'm a little bit afraid. And then today, CIA said people with 1 or 2 years, you're going away today. And we went to a location and they were gone. They were gone. And this is 1 week of what's going on. So there's a lot to be talked about today.
Thank you. Yes, definitely a lot of news, and that just scratches the surface.
Yeah.
Jennifer, what's got you? Well, actually, let me pose a different question to you, Jennifer. As we talked about earlier, clearly there's a new sheriff in town. We have a new president. We've had changes in administration before. This one maybe feels a little different, and it feels different at some very broad stroke governance level. And so before we really plumb into these specific areas of national security concern, given your background, could you perhaps talk to this new approach that this new administration seems to be taking just at the broadest governmental level?
So almost every modern presidential administration that has come into power comes in with some goals about improving government, creating efficiencies, spending the money more wisely. I can't really think of a modern presidency that hasn't come in with that type of goal. The most sort of earnest effort at that prior to this year was in the 1990s. Bill Clinton put Vice President Al Gore in charge of this commission. They went on for 5 or 6 years. They first put out this very detailed report. They were going to cut over $100 billion from the spending and create various efficiencies. They requested all of this stuff, and Congress came along and said, I don't think so. You can't do these things. And they basically said no to a lot of the things that the Al Gore Commission wanted to do. And so then it turned into a more protracted negotiation involving constituencies and the committees and so forth. And in the end, there were significant cuts that were made, more than 250,000 employees, more than $50 billion. It was more like half of what they had in mind originally in the original proposal, but it was done through an adjudicated sort of democratic rule of law-based process that was sort of led by Al Gore, but then constrained appropriately by the Congress. And that's not at all what we're seeing today. What we're seeing today is the Congress essentially abdicating its policymaking power to the executive branch. And the executive, the president, has appointed, not an official appointment that's gone through the normal process that gets approved by the Senate and so forth, and not an elected position, obviously, but in fact the person that donated the most money to help get him elected, which is concerning on ethical grounds, to a position that is now, as General Hayden just said, not just at the CIA, but across the board in almost every agency of the government, is enacting a very non-systematic, just sort of broad firing of people, closing of agencies, and so forth, in a way that really violates the whole sense of rule of law. Democracies are upheld on 4 basic pillars: elections, free and fair elections, voting rights, and civil liberties, and the rule of law. And we've had challenges on all of those pillars over the last number of years, but it's really that rule of law that is most under duress in the way that this really fundamental transformational change is happening in government, the way that the so-called Department of Government Efficiency is operating. I'm a Congress scholar, so the part about this that concerns me is the part where Congress is effectively doing nothing. And CNN was reporting yesterday that at the end of the president's speech the other night, some congressional leaders had gone to Elon Musk to ask him if they could please be at the negotiating table for some of this stuff. And to the very idea that there are congressional leaders that are asking for permission to do their own job, of somebody who effectively has no authority in the area but has been granted authority by the president, is really concerning. So the question, of course, is why? I'll stop filibustering here in a second. But why is this happening? Why isn't Congress performing its constitutional duty in the lawmaking process? And the answer is that it's partisanship in our politics. Polarization has sort of corrupted our institutions over the last several decades, 4 decades, and to the point where the appropriate mechanisms in the Constitution for constraining the executive that is overreaching is impeachment or other forms of constitutional mechanisms. And the Congress is unable to enact or to use those constitutional provisions right now because essentially party is more important and adherence to partisanship has become more important than the constitutional order and adhering to the rule of law. So Republicans, for the most part, in the House and the Senate right now care more about maintaining their partisan loyalty than they do about maintaining the congressional position in the three branches of government. And so as a Congress scholar, that one really, really keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I would imagine. Ellen, hearing what General Hayden had to say, hearing what Jennifer had to say, and given your focus on, security studies, national security, international security, what are you seeing to date as an organizing principle for national security with the new Trump administration?
So before I try to articulate how I think they see the world and the American role in it, I think I just want to start with the notion that most of us in this room come of age or have learned about international relations with some almost unspoken assumptions about American leadership in the world, and that an infrastructure that assumed that the United States had a leadership role to play. That many debates and controversies over whether American leadership was always benign, maybe it was too aggressive, maybe we overused military force, but there was an assumption that part of America's unique attributes as a wealthy country that doesn't face any direct territorial threats from any outside aggressor, that we enjoyed these privileges that also were that successive presidents, certainly since Franklin Roosevelt, have assumed that the United States has this role to play. And that the idea that we invested in the security of others to enhance our own security. The idea that cooperation was a net positive, even while we wanted to preserve our own, freedom of action and our own capabilities. So trust, cooperation, American leadership. I think all of those are a little bit shaky right now and are being questioned because of the, if you apply the true logic of America First, it's kind of a jungle out there. It's, the survival of the fittest. It's the, power determines which countries are winners and which countries are losers. So I feel like the foundations and the implicit assumptions of how we think about America's role in the world are really quite shaky right now. And we're already seeing some of the secondary effects, that countries that are now really not sure that the United States still is bound by commitments that were made over many decades, will start to take matters into their own hands. And agency of others is a very positive theme in the 21st century. I don't think the United States should assume to be the country with all the answers. And many people do want the United States. Can't you behave more like just a normal country? Why is there always this American exceptionalism? But I would just put a cautionary note down that as countries take into their own hands how they're going to protect their own security now that they're not 100% sure the U.S. will be there, we're going to see new friction and tension in the international system. And we certainly could see countries becoming, investing in their own military and security institutions, which is absolutely a legitimate function of government, but in ways that will make the world feel more chaotic and anarchic. Up to and including, and here I'd turn to Greg to say more, up to and including a proliferation of countries that believe that nuclear weapons is a way to strengthen their own security in a world where they're no longer confident that the United States will be the power that deters any aggression. So I think we're on shaky ground about the importance of alliances, and more generally, I think President Trump believes that the United States is a uniquely important country, but he really, this America First logic means that our commitments to other countries are really of secondary importance. So that really shifts how we think about America's role in the world.
Thank you. And you really went right into the question I was going to ask Greg, which is, okay, given what Ellen just said about that foundational shift, you live in a world that has relied on cooperation at an international level to try to control and manage the spread of very dangerous things, chemicals, biological agents, nuclear weapons, nuclear radiological devices, et cetera. Are you beginning to see in that world you live in manifestations of this shift? And how would you describe it?
Yeah, we're already seeing the consequences of an America First policy that is pulling back from multilateral organizations. The Trump administration has announced that they're withdrawing from the World Health Organization at the same time that we have a unchecked spread of H5N1 in this country, which is no longer on the front page because, as General Hayden already pointed out, there's so much going on every week. No one can keep track of what's going on with H5N1. The problem is H5N1 is usually talked about as a bird flu. It's not. It's a mammal flu. It's jumped from birds, now it's in cows and dairy herds all across the country. It's in cats, it's in mice, it's in rats, and it gets into humans very easily. So this is no longer a bird flu problem, which is the part of the problem with the current Trump policy to deal with H5N1 as with the goal of reducing the price of eggs, right? If that's your policy goal, you're going about it all wrong because this flu doesn't care about birds. It's now very happy to live in mammals, including us. We are having cases of humans in both the US and Canada being infected with H5N1 where there's no known exposure to cows or birds. And that means that there is cryptic transmission happening within communities that only pops up every now and then that we recognize someone's been infected. We don't know where it came from, which means that there are other people along that chain of transmission who we did not detect. And that's very reminiscent of how COVID got started very early on in China. So we're in a situation where we have a unchecked disease spreading. As Dr. Victor pointed out, we're already harming the functions of the US government that are essential to maintaining public health in terms of the firing of workers, not spending money that's been appropriated by Congress, these other things. And so our ability to handle an actual, if the H5N1 becomes a human pandemic, we are much less well prepared to deal with that even than we were in 2020 to deal with COVID. So, and we're going to do it in an environment where we're not part of the WHO. We're going to do it in an environment where it's going to be much harder to get international cooperation because we're imposing tariffs on our closest allies, and we're undermining the international institutions that normally we'd be working with to mobilize international support to deal with these kinds of things. Because at the end of the day, diseases don't know borders, pathogens don't have passports, and so any kind of solution to dealing with a pandemic or with nuclear proliferation, which I agree is another major a threat that's emerging now, can only be handled with international cooperation. And at this point, the Trump administration is doing everything possible to undermine those institutions and discard and abandon the allies and partners we've had for the last 80 years to work on these kinds of issues. So I actually have 2 pages of what keeps me up at night, but I'll leave it there and get to the other points later on tonight.
Yeah, so on that happy note, I would ask you folks, if you've got some questions, to start lining up. I'm going to go ahead and go to YouTube because the YouTube folks are awake and they're starting to ask questions there. So the first question, it's actually a handful of questions from folks, has to do with the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance. One question, for example, is, what's the likelihood that the U.S. would follow through on the threat to kick Canada out of Five Eyes, and what would be the impact if that happened? Another person just asked what's likely to happen to Five Eyes overall. Another one asks what's the best way that Europe could fill the gap that will be left by Americans' withdrawal from intelligence sharing. Someone else asks, even if we remove Canada from the Five Eyes sharing agreement, this is just a comment, it honestly has little tangible effect, et cetera. So, General Hayden, you are somebody that I know personally from our time at NSA was a strong advocate for intelligence sharing, not only among Five Eyes partners, but amongst a broader array of nations around the world.
So let's talk about the Five Eyes, okay? This is coming after the Second World War. And now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them are maybe in 1 or 2 years after the war, they said, we want to do more for signals intelligence, okay? It's really, it doesn't do much for CIA, it's NSA, okay? So it's very, very important. I'm worried about that, okay? So, for example, I had a system at NSA that after 9/11, and the president said, I want to do this, okay? I can't talk to the British about that, okay? And after 4 or 5 years, it got out, and one of the people in GCHQ was there talking to me and said, I had no idea. And that's a good thing, okay? And so in Northern Ireland, there was a real problem for Northern Ireland, and there was almost a war, okay? We had nothing to do with that in the United States. That was something that was completely different, okay? But most of the time, we do some things for the Five Eyes. When I was CIA NSA director at 9/11, I had more than 100 people at Fort Meade that were Five Eyes people, okay? And actually, 2 of them wouldn't go home. They stayed because, well, they're our friends. So if we do something about this, and it's bad now, it'll be really, really bad for America and our other friends. I'm really worried about that.
So to amplify on what General Hayden said, I spent quite a bit of time in my time at NSA helping to manage foreign partnerships, and then with General Hayden as director of CIA, we were on the road quite often, and many of those trips were to go and meet with foreign intelligence agencies in their countries. So the United States has a robust network of intelligence sharing relationships with dozens of countries, and they range from, as General Hayden described, a relationship with these Five Eyes countries that's largely transparent.
Right.
We collect things for each other, we collect them together, we analyze them.
It's a team.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be hard to pull the strands apart to say
Exactly.
what's British, what's Canadian, what's Australian, what's American, what's, you might be able to do what's New Zealand, that might be easy. But there's, a clear shared culture, shared common language, largely shared national security interests, with the exceptions, as General Hayden mentioned. The Brits clearly cared a lot about what was going on in Northern Ireland.
Right.
We were not part of that.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So yes, there have been threats by this administration to cut Canada out of the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. Would that harm the United States intelligence? There would be ramifications,
Yes,
I
it
think.
would.
There are things the Canadians probably do for us. Obviously, we can't go into details, but the Five Eyes partnership is such that some countries do something for the whole that is not duplicated by the others.
Well, for example, Canada goes to things for, Canada will do some things that the United States can't do,
Right.
okay? And they do that for us all the time.
Yes, some of these countries have access to locations and countries
That we can't.
that we just can't because of the nature, the status of our diplomatic relations.
Yeah.
And so they will do things for us. They may have geographic locations on the other side of the world that we don't have, that we can then take full advantage of.
Yep.
So very, very robust partnerships at that Five Eyes level. But then there are partnerships with many other countries, most of which tend to be transactional. We give them stuff, they give us stuff back.
And by the way, most of the time, it's NSA divvying for the other person, okay? That's okay, because we do some things for us as well. That's a good thing.
Yeah, many of these partnerships, the U.S. is obviously the larger player, more technologically advanced, and may actually be the street, the highway between us. You know, there may be a lot of traffic coming from the U.S. going to that way,
Yeah.
and not a lot coming this way. But what ultimately comes in this direction, and this was something General Hayden made clear at his time at NSA, was an indebtedness.
Right.
These smaller countries become indebted to the United States for the technological capabilities, for the raw intelligence, for the analysis that we can provide them. We then, however, can benefit from some of these countries' cultural backgrounds, language backgrounds, geographic locations.
That's exactly
et cetera.
correct.
So, can the U.S. go it alone? And we could try.
For SIGINT, no.
No, SIGINT, no, we could not go it alone because we don't have the geographic locations
That's
that would be
right.
able to do everything. HUMINT, as General Hayden describes, a whole different story. You know, their human partnerships tend to be, well,
I can,
yeah,
okay. So I was at CIA now, and I said, you know, I have a lot of people from the Five Eyes at NSA. Why don't we do it here too? And my deputy said, that's not going to happen.
right. Yeah, physical
It's-
co-location.
It's completely different, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Can I just add, my understanding was that the Trump administration may have already done a carve-out for the Canadians in terms of the integration of effort in Northern Command, in Strat Command,
Oh, my.
Stratcom, that they're using the national security exception, I think, waiver. So even when there's a lot of tension over trade and over a lot of political aspects of the relationship, I believe, I thought this week, there was some, but not, basically saying, but we do want the national security partnership to continue. So that could change any moment,
yeah.
but I do think there's, for all of us that work on national security, of whether, when push comes to shove, there will be some, carve-outs or exceptions made to allow for some continuity in security relationships. It will require the new cabinet officers to make the case for some continuity, even when there's rhetoric of much more disruptive change. I think, in fact, some things will be quietly permitted to continue.
And I think even in the Ukraine case, we've
Yep.
seen some describe the edict that came down to no longer share intelligence. I believe there was an exception for forced protection
Right,
material.
right.
Well, in reality, most of what we were probably sharing with them was forced protection related information anyway. So some of the suspension may have been more for show than reality. All right, we do have some folks lining up, so why don't I'll start over here with this first gentleman here.
Okay. So I'm Mohammed Fadag. We've got a broad swath of intelligence and national security experience on this panel. I was just wondering how might young professionals enter this industry and become perhaps intelligence analysts or work in national security?
Sure. I don't know, Ellen, do you want to take a shot at that?
Well, I think a lot of our students at the Schar School do aspire to going into government service. We're at a weird moment right now where we don't know, is the door open at least a little bit? Is it it's shutting in some areas, or is the door still open? And sooner or later, the government will need to replenish personnel at various levels. So, I think that being in the Washington area is an advantage. You are allowed to have access to recruiters from national security institutions. You're allowed to, even interact with them a little bit in public events. So I encourage you to, participate as widely as you can. to try to understand it. But maybe your question was a little more specific than that, but I think there are opportunities to learn about what kind of positions are out there. And even though it looks like things are, in a state of tremendous uncertainty, sooner or later there will be some new equilibrium point, and we'll have a better understanding of which positions are still recruiting for entry-level people going into these institutions.
Yeah, it is tumultuous. Just to follow up, do you think it's more?
General Hayden did want to
Yeah.
say something.
Yeah.
So at the first Trump administration, people came and talked with me. We go to the McLean family restaurant, and they meet with me. And I said, go and do your job. It'll be okay. The second administration is now there. I don't know that would be okay. In fact, I'm worried about that. So if I call people now and say, could I go to CIA or NSA? I would say, I just don't know. I just don't know. And believe me, I've done that for 30 years. And now I'm saying, I just don't know. I just don't know.
So you had a follow on?
Yeah. On that note, would you say it's more because there's less recruitment, maybe on the government side? Is there more of a focus on private intelligence companies or contractors?
So you bring up a very interesting point. The government is in the process of shrinking, as Jennifer discussed, across the board. They believe there are efficiencies that may be gained through automation, through artificial intelligence, et cetera. At the end of the day, I think they're going to run smack dab into the reality that there's a lot of requirements that the government is still going to need to respond to, particularly in the national security and intelligence arena. When that has happened in the past, with some urgency, 9/11 is a great example. The way the government most quickly responds is by hiring contractors. And so I would personally envision that you could see, maybe not this year, but maybe next year, you could begin to see an explosion of interest on the part of defense contractors, intelligence-related companies looking to hire people to go in and fill some of the gaps that are probably going to be created by some of the downsizing and some of the lack of hiring that is happening right now. So I think keeping your eye on that, going to career fairs, going to websites, investigating what job opportunities might exist would be a good idea.
I would just add that as the federal government shrinks, state and local governments are going to be picking up some of the slack, and so paying attention to opportunities at the state and local levels will be important as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and I think particularly in areas like cyber security and some things where the federal government, at least with this administration, appears interested in delegating responsibilities to the state and local level.
Yeah, and that's also true in terms of the fact that there's a lot of geopolitical change going on now. Companies are worried about what is going on. And so you have lots of companies in the tech sector that are looking for advice about how do we navigate US-China competition, what do we do about emerging technologies, export controls, sanctions. In the world of global health security, there's a lot of companies that provide private biosurveillance technology information, and especially to the extent that the CDC and WHO are not providing the information that people need, they're going to be looking for solutions in the private sector and looking for ways to leverage open source information for that purpose as well. So I think there'll be a lot of, not just in the contractors, but private sector, whose client is the private sector, is going to be a growth area, because the landscape is only getting more complicated and more dangerous, and so there's going to be a continued demand for knowledge and expertise. So I think there's definitely still a role for people with that skill set that will still be in demand.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Gentleman in the gray suit.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming to speak to us today and for your respective services. My question is a little holistic, but would you definitively consider the world order that being collapsed? Is it repairable by any future administrations? And if not, do you see any effective solutions that ensure our security in the same degree without it? Thank you.
So So there is a really interesting question of whether there ever was a world order that everybody bought into the same values, norms, et cetera. We probably had, for most of the Cold War period, two orders. We had an order that was led by the West, that the United States was the principal organizer and and articulated what it is that binds us together. And there was the communist world that, with China playing a kind of passive tag-along role, if you will. There was the world of a single superpower from the collapse of the Soviet Union, maybe till the invasion of Iraq, maybe a little bit later, was an order that the United States really dominated. I mean, indisputably, we dominated. And so I do think that we have to think in kind of the edges around what the concept of order is are very fuzzy right now. I think you could say the old liberal order is no longer operative. We don't yet see whether there is a clarity to a new order that's going to emerge, or whether we will have more than one order. Are we living in a multipolar, a world in which power is diffused? There could be an Asian order and a Western order. That's one scenario. But none of this has really crystallized yet. I do think that the way the Trump administration looks at America's role in the world and the values it wants to promote suggests that it doesn't aspire to be the organizing player that would apply to many, many other countries. It's a little bit, every country goes it alone. So it's a world possibly, some people are using the phrase, the new world disorder. And so I think hasn't yet crystallized into any understanding of where we are.
Anybody else?
Good evening. My name is.
Sorry. I would recommend if we could keep the microphones on the stand, because I think it just creates a lot of extra noise moving them on and off. And you can just bend it up a little higher or whatever. There you go.
Perfect. Good evening. You'll hear me clearly?
Yep.
My name is Ian. I'm a student here at the Schar School, and I appreciate you all taking the time to be here this evening. It was mentioned kind of in the opening statements that decades of assumptions around American leadership are kind of being challenged. And I think advocates of American leadership, such as myself, have maybe become complacent in that time and haven't really developed effective communication strategies to counteract critics of that system that are probably making many of the foreign policy decisions that we're seeing today. I think the Biden administration took a crack at it with the foreign policy for the middle class, and it just didn't resonate. So when you all think about that reality, how do you all sort of consider the very long history of American leadership on the international stage, and how to distill that history to the American people to kind of present a message advocating for that system?
Greg, would you want to take a shot?
Sure. So, one of the challenges we face is, again, the international order in general and U.S. leadership has not always been perfect or well done in lots of ways. But throughout the Cold War, we avoided World War III, right? We avoided major catastrophes. In the post-Cold War order, the U.S. was incredibly secure in a lot of ways, and the global economy took off, and the amount of people who are living freely and fairly also increased dramatically. And the problem is that people get used to it and they take that for granted. The same way that the success of vaccines and the diminishment of things like measles, suddenly people are like, well, we don't really need vaccines anymore. Well, you only think that because vaccines have been so good at eradicating this thing that we used to be worried about that we don't miss it anymore. And I think now we're seeing what happens when the U.S. is not taking a leadership role, when the U.S. is not standing by its allies and is rolling back commitments we've had in place for decades. You start seeing what happens with countries like Russia and China taking advantage of that. So even if we are moving to a multipolar world, which I don't dispute, that is still a world in which it makes sense to have more allies than less. Because if you are dealing with a rising China with a growing economy, a growing military, expansionist aims, you have Russia that is obviously expansionist in Europe, and Ukraine is probably only the first step of that. Right, we are more secure if we're dealing with those kinds of threats with our allies rather than doing it alone. And up until now, the idea of America first, America alone was hypothetical. That is becoming more real. And I think now that people are starting to see what that means in reality, hopefully there'll be a little bit more understanding of the fact that some of the assumptions that people had were taken for granted are there. Back in the 90s, Joe Nye had a saying that security is like oxygen. You only miss it when it's gone. And I think that's the environment we're living in now, where people suddenly realize, the Five Eyes are really important. NATO actually is really important. World Health Organization, really important. We were taking it for granted because it was doing what it was supposed to be doing,
Right.
and preventing the problems that now we're seeing are manifest. I would say that, unfortunately, we're dealing with an experiment now of what happens when we take away all the things that we've built over the last 80 years, and we're starting to see some of the consequences.
Jennifer?
I interpret your question as sort of a messaging question, like how do we tell the story or a narrative to the American people that would improve sort of the buy-in to the system. I do think that narrative and storytelling is really important in that. Things like NATO and the World Health Organization are gigantic institutions that may be difficult for people to feel like they can relate to or wrap their heads around. But at the end of the day, people understand, I think, intuitively, that connections create security, that humans are about relationships. Politics is about relationships. And if we can understand or explain or use narrative to explain the international system and the United States' place in it as a system of connections, I'm a network scholar if you can't tell, as a system of connections, and that the more connections, positive connections you have with people, the more secure, the greater sense of trust and alliance and cooperation you can create along the lines that Greg is saying, then I think that is, I'm not the storyteller itself, I just understand the principles, those who can do. But the idea of explaining the importance of developing connections in the international system to make America a safer place as both a investment in ourselves and also in the world, I think, to me, is a potentially resonating message.
So I just wanted to bring in one factual dimension here that might be of use. The Chicago Council for Global Affairs has been polling the American public about how they want, what they think America's role in the world should be for more than 50 years. Right. The most recent poll was one of the lowest ever of whether Americans think it's important for us to be engaged in the world. It had always been across party lines in the high 60% of Americans strongly believed that the US had a role to play, and they particularly liked when we go out and help other people, like humanitarian aid. They really liked, crisis response and helping people in the developing world. Controversy, maybe less support for military interventions. But so what I'm saying is there's a systemic shift in what the American people want, and I think that's one of the reasons. The numbers for the most recent were like 56%, one of the lowest ever. So you still have at least a portion of independents and Republicans who would agree. They're not all liberal internationalists. It's not like they're running to get involved in every problem around the world, but that level of sort of organic support for the United States as a global actor has shrunk. And so I think that was something that the Dems were going to struggle with one way or the other. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm going to honor our virtual audience who are out there asking questions. So we've got a question. This is actually from a friend of mine. I'm part of a ever-dwindling group of people that actually lived in, Americans that lived in Iran. I lived there when I was in high school, and this question comes from a middle school, high school friend of mine. There's been very little discussion about our stance with dealing with Iran in the past month. Do we have any thoughts on the impact these changes will have on keeping Iran in check? I think we could broaden that question, and maybe I could look to you, Ellen, to talk about sort of that broader Middle East, Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iranian proxy situation. Where do you see it standing, and how do you see the new administration responding to the crisis there?
So President Trump has reasserted what he called in the first time he was in office, maximum pressure on Iran, which is distinct from total solidarity with Israel's approach to Iran. So I think we have a triangular problem here of to what extent is Israel trying to push both the past administration and the current administration to be even more aggressive in preventing Iran from certainly crossing the nuclear threshold, but also punishing Iran for its disruptive role in the region with its support for various militia groups, subnational groups. The person that the Trump administration has named to be the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Eldridge Colby, has completely switched his position on Iran. He was arguing when he was out of government that Iran isn't that important. We should just kind of not worry about it. More important to focus on China. Let's not make Iran so critical to our foreign policy. He's now, sort of endorsing maximum pressure. It's important to note that when President Trump signed an executive order to increase sanctions against Iran in the last week or so, he made a very interesting comment. He said, I really am reluctant to do this. I don't want to be punishing the Iranian people. I would like to talk to Iran. So there's something happening at two levels with Iran. It's maximum pressure, but it's also, I think he is intrigued by the idea that there's other ways to de-escalate tensions in the region. So it's possibly an area of disagreement between the United States and Israel. And the other news of the last 24 hours is that the administration has acknowledged that it has spoken directly to Hamas. In all the long period of trying to negotiate a ceasefire in the Gaza war, it's always been the Qataris that were the interface with Hamas. And so Egypt, the US, and Qatar have been working these negotiations. The US was not directly in touch with Hamas, now is. So there's an interesting pattern emerging of whether the Trump administration just wants to go directly to the adversaries and say, let's talk, instead of this more indirect diplomatic dance that has not, in their view, produced the results they want.
And Greg, I was just going to ask you about the proliferation implications, particularly, Iran is a major proliferator of technologies and developer of things we don't like that you focus on. If you could comment on that and whatever else you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, so in the Iran case on the nuclear program, there are two clocks that are ticking.
Yeah.
One clock is the Iranian nuclear program keeps advancing. The IAEA just released a report that said that Iran now has 6 bombs worth of highly enriched uranium. Does not mean they actually have the bomb, but they have enough highly enriched uranium to make 6 bombs if they want to. And that is an increase from the last time the IAEA reported that, and that will likely increase again the next time they make this report. So Iran's program is advancing steadily. At the same time, there is a UN Security Council resolution that has a provision that allows what are called snapback sanctions to be imposed on Iran if they're not in compliance with the IAEA, which they are not. That resolution expires in October. And so after that resolution expires, the ability to impose these sanctions goes away. And so European countries, France, Germany, UK, are very interested in using those sanctions, that possibility for those sanctions as a way to get Iran back to the table and have them stop advancing the program and ideally roll it back. But their leverage is going to go away after October. So there's going to be a lot of pressure between now and October, probably culminating this summer, where Iran's program is advancing. Europeans are trying to get sanctions from the UN. US sanctions are being imposed and escalated. And then what is Iran going to do in response? And likely they are not going to just say, okay, you're right, we're going to stop and we're going to get rid of our program, right? So that is all going to come to a head this summer. And so I'm not going to make predictions about how that's going to turn out, but this is going to be the period in which you're going to have the most intense concerns about how far Iran has gone with the nuclear program, and also a recognition that whatever leverage comes out of US sanctions or UN sanctions is going to kind of diminish greatly after October. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on all sides to get something done. So I'd just say keep an eye on what happens in that space the next couple of months.
Okay. Let's get back to our in-house audience over here.
Hi, Oswaldo Silva. I'm in the ISEC program. I appreciate the opportunity to learn from this wonderful panel. I see the criminal networks, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and illicit trade entanglement with criminalized states and illiberal regimes to be one of the greatest national security challenges. And we see how the current administration has designated drug cartels and criminal organizations as terrorist groups. So I would like to know your thoughts about if there are steps to create like a more cooperation in the Americas to address these issues, or is this more about maybe addressing the migration issue and all this rhetoric with the border security?
Who would like to take a stab?
Okay, so I'll say a couple of things. So the designation of cartels and transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations clearly rhetorically has a lot of power, and so there's a lot of appeal and political performance value of doing that. It does provide some extra authorities and legal capabilities that U.S. agencies now have that they didn't have traditionally. But the concern is that twofold. One is that will actually reduce cooperation with countries in Central and South America, because we're now going to be looking at them as sponsors of terrorism or harboring terrorist groups. And everyone knows from the experience of the global war on terrorism how the U.S. responds to perceived terrorist threats, which typically does not involve, it can involve very intrusive actions that countries do not like. And so there's, I think, going to be a lot of concern that the foreign terrorist organization designation is not just for the legal powers it gives to agencies to do more in terms of sanctions and whatnot, but it will start bringing in more of the military, paramilitary, covert tools the U.S. has used in the broader war on terrorism that we've seen for the last 20 years. And that is probably not the right way to deal with these kinds of organizations. And so there's a concern that the mindset and the tools that come along with counterterrorism are not really what's going to be effective dealing with organizations that are producing drugs and doing human trafficking and drug smuggling. So I'm worried that disconnect is going to get bigger, and that actually will backfire and make it harder to cooperate with the countries we need to cooperate with.
I want to say I agree totally, because now CIA is doing more and more, and it's not a good idea for CIA to do much more than that. So I agree totally.
I would just add, as the domestic politics person here, I would just add that the political rhetoric that Trump has used for basically his entire political career, that is engaged in criminalizing migrants, talking about invasion at the border and so forth, it's a political strategy that is not based in fact, right? He doesn't reflect actual numbers about migrants or immigration or violence or so forth. He will showcase or cherry pick specific cases to create senses of fear. It's a strategy that he uses to gain a political following and to build his coalition through aspects of fear. So, right, this is what authoritarians do when they want to build a political, it's one strategy that authoritarians use for building political coalitions is to create a sense of fear, a sense of threat, because it does two things. It helps to identify those people who share the same fear to join your coalition, but then it also creates the political impetus to give the person who is coming to save you from the things that you should be afraid of more authority. Right, so it's also an effort to expand the scope of authority to the presidency, which is the same thing we're seeing with the DOGE, right? So right. DOGE is not about creating efficiencies in government. It's very clearly, DOGE's initial actions have been very clearly targeted at agencies that are perceived to be liberal in the government, and so it's a politically targeted effort aimed at ultimately consolidating power in the executive and subverting the regular policymaking process of government.
Yeah, to pile on a little bit on what Greg and General Hayden said, and Jennifer as well, the border fight, the border challenge raises a lot of civil liberties and protection issues as well. Yep. As we have heard, many of the people crossing the border, bringing these precursors and illicit drugs into the country, are American citizens. They may be dual citizenship, and in many cases they may be strictly just American citizens. You begin to try to do the target network analysis that a good CIA intelligence officer would have done in the war on terror, and now you're flying drones, and you got drones with missiles, and you could very, very easily and very quickly find yourself launching a missile against a group of American citizens. Now, they're bad. They're bad people. They shouldn't be doing this. More people get killed in America with fentanyl than get killed by terrorists around the world. So something does need to be done to stop it, but we really need to pause and reflect on those civil liberty protection concerns that I think we all share as a value.
Yep.
Please.
Thank you.
Sorry, it's been a minute since I've used a microphone. So my question to the panel, Anderson Miles, a former alumni of the International Security Program. My question to you folks is, in regards to HPSC's role in Congress, do you think that they're going to look into DOGE and some of the security clearances within DOGE and where that data is going?
Who knows?
So HPSC's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or affectionately referred to as HPSC, is an interesting beast. In conversations at times, we've sometimes referred to the HPSC as the land of forgotten toys, or whatever it's called in that Rudolph thing. It's being on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence doesn't get a congressman the kinds of things being on an appropriations committee or the defense committee or the foreign affairs committee. It's a little bit, it's got some prestige, but it's a little bit of a backwater place, doesn't?
B-list, we call
Yeah,
it.
Yeah.
thank you. It's a B-list place. And so often some of the best and brightest Congress people are not put there, number one. Number two, given the current environment, the genuflection of the House Republicans, who are in the majority, to the White House and to the executive, I frankly don't see the House Intelligence Committee of any committee doing any kind of examination of DOGE and its impact on security, classification clearances, intelligence posture at all. If anything, they'll hold hearings to applaud what's happening.
Yeah.
That's
I
my
agree.
personal view.
I totally agree. There appears to be no appetite to engage in oversight of the administration of any kind. Oversight is one of the primary responsibilities of the U.S. Congress. There's three branches. There's supposed to be checks and balances, and oversight is the way that the legislative is supposed to check the executive. But that isn't one of those connections in that triad that is completely broken right now as a result of the way partisanship operates in the constitutional order.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you. The panel has already addressed the shedding of institutional norms and guardrails. Currently, the use of AI in warfare is at least loosely informed by international humanitarian law. What are your thoughts on the possibility of unrestrained AI-led warfare in the near future, possibly buoyed by the promise of efficiency and preventing American loss of life, and what effect would that have on global warfare?
Ellen, you want to take a shot?
So this is way outside my comfort zone, but look, I think there's a lot of serious debate in national security institutions about the importance of keeping humans involved in every decision related to the use of force. I mean, that is a pretty fundamental principle, that the serious responsibility to use lethal force against any target has ethical and moral dimensions to it, as well as political dimensions. And so far, I think people are very much seized with how do we make sure that there's still a chain of command and a transparency to where is the human level of responsibility. I'm sure there are systems, autonomous weapons, et cetera, where once you start to use it, you may diminish or dilute the human control. So these are really big issues. I think there's some conversation at the international level, but in an adversarial world, each country is going to sort of make up its own rules, I think. And we are, just to add to the list of things that are getting kind of a little fuzzy around the edges is, the Geneva Convention and the laws of war. I mean, I think people don't know quite how to inject a new conversation about AI into what has been a, functioning but not perfect set of legal principles that relate to armed combat.
Yeah, and I think the other problem we have in this space is as this technology is moving forward, the people who are in charge of deciding whether or not to use it don't understand it.
Yes.
And so you have a situation where if you have policymakers who do not understand, how AI works, they're more likely to be not even misusing it on purpose, but just using it poorly. There was actually just an article, I think, in Foreign Policy, where a think tank ran some crisis simulations using AI agents, and they found that the AI decision-making agents were more escalatory than the human players. But figuring out why that is, that's very complicated, right? Because these things are a black box. So I think we run a lot of risks putting faith in these kinds of systems that are not well understood. And if they're being developed in an organization that doesn't have an inspector general, or the judge advocate generals have been replaced, and so there are people who are not necessarily having the highest legal standards, or you now have Elon Musk in Doge promoting technologies his company is developing, because not only is he the biggest donor, right? He's running all these companies that are profiting from these things, right? That's a huge conflict of interest. And so when you're dealing with conflict with technology, it's already not well understood, and the stakes are extremely high in terms of using this technology for military purposes. There's just a lot of potential for things to go very wrong. And so this is not the time when you want to be doing those kinds of experiments.
So to look at our questions from YouTube again, there's pressing concern that we're avoiding an issue here, so I'm going to go ahead and just drop it on the floor. The question is, what do we think are the security ramifications of what at least appears to be President Trump's affinity towards Russia, towards Putin, towards autocracies, and at the same time that he is showing an affinity or a deference, he's attacking longstanding allies, Canada, Mexico, Great Britain, et cetera. Anybody want to grab that one?
Well, I'll start.
All right.
I'm really worried, okay? The president is really, what I want to say is he's in charge, and now he's really in charge. And that is a real problem, I think. So I'm worried. So what if I was going back to CIA and I was in the administration? What do you think about on Monday or Tuesday doing the PDB? And something is going on, and the president says, well, I want to do this. Now, I've had that problem for when I was CIA, but I was able to talk to the president. Okay? One time, I was at almost at Christmas time, and I went up to Camp David. And it was just me, the president, and my deputy. And we talked for an hour. And I said, I'm not so sure we could do this. Well, tell me about it. And we talked, okay? And then after that, we went out and go back to CIA. And it was really interesting. What would we do now? And it was plain that the president said, you do think about it, and if you decide that was a good idea, we'll do it, and if we don't, we won't do that.
So he gave you leeway.
That's exactly correct.
On a sensitive operation.
A very sensitive operation.
Yes.
And we did it. We actually did it, and it was okay. But again, the president is very important. And if the president doesn't say something about it, or he just does something what he wants to do, that would be really, let's just leave it like that.
So my answer, I want to say something that is perhaps radical, but I want, and maybe it is, but I want to try to make the case that it's important to wrestle with it. And that is, that the United States is no longer classified as a democracy. But it's important to appreciate that democracy is not a binary. It's not a dichotomy. It's not necessarily, yes, democracy, no, it's not just democracy and dictatorships in the world, right? So it's a spectrum, right? And so the step down from democratic governance is often referred to as a system called competitive authoritarianism. And so I think it's really important for us to understand what that is and to accept that that is the state that we live in now. So a state of competitive authoritarianism is one where elections probably still happen. And as long as there is still some sense that elections are free and fair in most places, in most venues, and the fact that we have a very disaggregated, decentralized system for elections in the United States turns out to be in our favor here, then we will still have elections. You may still even have the opposition party win power from time to time. I have the sense that the United States is in a sort of pendular equilibrium where when Republicans win, the Republican Party is more interested in authoritarian style control. We will see more authoritarian style government. When the Democrats win power, I mean, this is what we've seen over the last 10 years, you get a more sort of traditional democratic, slightly messy, not perfect, but adherence to democratic norms, institutions, and values style of governance. And that we may be, political scientists that study elections in the United States have described the last couple decades of elections in the United States as being thermostatic. And that is the idea that the electorate takes the sort of temperature of what's going on in the country. And if they don't like what's happening, they change the dial and go to the other side. And we've seen this, because of the way partisan polarization works, we've seen this kind of swinging of power from one side to the other over the last several decades. And I think it's likely, I mean, one potential scenario where we're going to go here is that we'll be stuck kind of in this pendular equilibrium, oscillating between various forms of slightly more democratic to slightly more authoritarian and stylized versions of them for a period of time. And I could talk more about that if people have
That's
follow-up
exactly
questions.
what was happening now for drone strikes. They're more aggressive now than it was 2 months ago.
Now, looking around the world, what might be the closest country to what you're describing? You know, this competitive authoritarianism. Is there a country out there that we could look to and go, we're in that, or we're headed towards that?
I think it's a combination of countries. I don't know if there's one exactly. The United States is unique in a number of different ways, and so there is no perfect metaphor out there. In terms of executive power, I think Viktor Orban's Hungary is a pretty good example of kind of where we're going, where we're the kind of track that we're headed on. But the United States has, you can also look at Turkey, you can look at Venezuela, but the United States has a number of systems in terms of federalism and the way the presidential system and the way the parties operate that is not a perfect replica of any other system in the world. And you know, nothing is perfect. This is all, it's good and it's bad. I'm here not to be a partisan, but I am supportive of democracy. Right. You know, I support science and I support democracy. And I'm not afraid to say that in a classroom or an audience. Right. There's a lot of evidence that as imperfect as democracy is in the United States and around the world, we see greater prosperity and greater security and greater welfare across greater populations of people under democratic systems, right? So I think it's worthwhile to invest in democracies. There are lots of people who, you know, democracies are quite problematic, and we've gone through lots of periods. You know, another way to think about this is just through U.S. history. If you don't want to think about other countries in the world, arguably the United States became a democracy not until 1965 when we passed the Voting Rights Act, because voting rights are you can't be a democracy unless the adult population can vote, and there was a whole segment of the adult population that couldn't vote really until 1965. Or at least some segment or another was highly restricted. So if we had sort of peak democracy in the United States between 1965 and 2013, 2013 is when you get the Shelby County versus Holder case that underwrites the Voting Rights Act. So on the using the metric of voting rights, we passed peak democracy over a decade ago in the United States. And, people in this room were alive prior to 1965. Like, we have lived through periods of US history where the whole country was not perfectly something that we would consider a full-bred democracy. For most of our history, in fact, that has been true. And so I think I don't know, this is how I think about it, either in terms of internationally or historically. We need to, I don't want to say not be afraid of systems that aren't democratic. We should value systems that are democratic and work towards those that are offer more democratic institutions, values, and protections. But that when we see the backlash against them, it's important to engage in democratic practices, engage in supporting voting and building community and all of the things that we do that support democracies.
Thanks. Ellen, did you have anything? No. Okay. I think we were over here. I think we're probably going to have time for maybe 2, maybe 3 more questions, so I apologize. We'll try to get through everybody, so maybe we try to be quickly with the questions, and we'll try to be quick with answers. Yeah.
So many analysts across the IC believe China will invade Taiwan by 2027. Do you think the current administration will reaffirm our commitment and come to the aid of Taiwan? And if we do, what will the nuclear threshold be for this conflict? And if we do not, what will this mean for the United States geopolitically, socially, economically?
Gentlemen?
Yeah, I don't think so.
That's a quick answer. Greg?
So, so I don't think, countries don't invade other countries on a timetable. So 2027 is not a date where something will happen. A country might want to be ready to do something by then, but no decisions are being made like that. What the U.S. response would be if China was threatening to do that, I could have told you that a couple months ago. Now, who knows? One of the important lessons to take away from this is the way the U.S. acts towards one ally and one set of countries is viewed by the rest of the world. And so the Chinese, were looking at how the Biden administration responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and looked at how well Ukraine did in relation to their, desires to reclaim Taiwan. They're going to be recalculating the same thing, looking at how the current administration is treating Ukraine and our other allies. So it's not just a matter of what the Chinese want, but when they look at how the U.S. acts globally with other countries, they're going to be taking that into calculation. And I think it's very short-sighted for the U.S. to be making decisions based on very narrow tactical issues without taking into account the fact that there are other countries out there that are watching what we're doing and will be making decisions about how to take advantage of what we're doing in different parts of the world. So I think that's problematic.
I'll just add maybe 2 short points. One is that the way the Trump administration thinks about China as a more than a problem/threat for American interests, I don't think Taiwan is top of the list. So I think they would be more possibly accepting that China asserts its, dominance over Taiwan. Second point is that I think the Chinese probably would like to achieve their goals on Taiwan without necessarily having to do full-scale invasion. There's just too many examples out there that you get bogged down. We don't think the Taiwanese are ready yet to, mount a significant resistance towards Chinese attacks, but I think probably the Chinese would still prefer to achieve their political objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan without having to do a full-scale war.
All right, over here.
Yep.
Good evening. My name is McKenna Rice. I'm a final semester ISEC student graduating this May. My question is, with the dismantling of foreign aid systems in the United States, what humanitarian disasters should we keep an eye on, and what conflicts related to those have the most potential to be exacerbated by these, maybe ones that aren't in the news as frequently, thinking like Sudan?
I will be very short. This is one time that I think it was awful that we have done for foreign aid. It was good. We did a lot, and now we don't do it at all. What I want to say is it'll be bad, 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 and you'll see much more about that. I'm really sad. The Secretary of Defense went and talked to Congress and said, I want foreign aid. You have to get foreign aid. And they did. But now the president just said it won't happen. And it's wrong, but it's also bad policy.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say that, dismantling USAID and cutting off foreign aid is destroying 60 years of soft power that the U.S. invested. And the effects, I think, are going to not necessarily be the big conflicts that re-emerge or whatever, but it's going to be all the invisible cases of people who are not getting TB medicine, HIV medicine. Their Ebola outbreaks are going to spread in Africa. There are going to be diseases that are going to be crossing borders much more easily because of the efforts that were funded by the U.S. The U.S. is the largest funder of humanitarian aid in the world, and we underpin a lot of the global health work that's done around the world, and a lot of those efforts are going to collapse very quickly without U.S. support. And it's going to lead to a lot of unneeded and unnecessary deaths that could have been easily avoided. And on top of that, it's going to also, aside from the moral case for it and the humanitarian cost it's going to impose, it's also a strategic blunder, as the general was saying, because other countries will happily step in, like Russia and China and Iran and others, to use their soft power to gain influence in other regions in ways that, in the long term, are definitely going to be detrimental. So on every facet of the decision, I think it's going to cost us both in the short term and the long term, and it's unfortunately going to cost the lives of lots of people who are in these countries who would otherwise be benefiting from the health assistance that we provide.
Okay, so I do apologize. I think we're just going to have time for one more question. This gentleman right here.
Right.
And the rest of you, save your questions and come chat with us in the reception afterwards.
So the executor of a lot of policy ends up being our military. And so the United States is unique, really, compared to a lot of portions of the world that rely on an all-volunteer force. And so what I would like to ask you as a security challenge, is there any scenario where civ-mil relations over the next 4 to 6 years becomes a national security challenge, given that usually that all-volunteer force are by design subjugated to civilian control by design, but also the officer cadre swears an oath to the Constitution. And so is there a scenario where those come into conflict that we should be looking out for?
Well, as a retired four-star Air Force general, sir, what's your thoughts?
I would be concerned. I really, I know a lot in the military now, today. They're good people, but, after the Chief of Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he left. Why is that? I don't know. There's not a good reason. Why did he leave? How about the woman in charge of the Navy? What about the number 2 man in the Air Force? And how about all the 3 chiefs of staff? JAGs.
The lawyers.
Okay? So I'm really worried. We didn't have a problem. What we did 4 or 5 years ago, but people know what to do. After that, and what happened in the 10 days ago, I'm really worried about that. I'm really worried. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to say, but I think you know what I mean.
Jennifer?
Yeah, in addition to letting all of those commanders go that the general was just talking about, the person that's now been appointed the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is like a 3-star. They went over a lot of heads to find somebody, and so you have to ask yourself, well, why did they do that? And so it certainly looks like that the firings were done on some political grounds. There is a war against DEI, this sense of diversity, the sense that anybody who's not white and not male can't hold a leadership position, or if they got into one, it must be for something that is inappropriate or unqualified. And so they fire the people that don't fit the profile that they want to prefer, and elevate those that they think are going to be loyal. So I don't know that that's why they did what they did, but that's what it looks like they did what they did, right? Yeah.
I know the man that will become chief of staff. He's a really good man. So I think he'll be okay. But what happened 10 days ago was awful. That was awful. Now maybe he will be very good. I know him. I think a lot of him, okay? But again, it'll be very hard to do that after what happened 10 days ago.
I think we have probably the most professional military in the world, and those who are being chosen, even those who are being chosen over several other people before them, have benefited from this professional military education that, again, is some of the best in anywhere in the world, and in terms of leadership training is the best in the United States. And so I think we can find some solace in that, but it is worrying that it appears the reasons that they're doing this are because they're looking for loyalty.
Right.
That's true.
I think we want, well, as you've said before, when he was elected the first time, the military is not going to follow an unlawful order. Hopefully that remains. Greg?
Well, and also just to add to that, the fact that Trump pardoned convicted court-martialed
Yes.
officers who, what's that?
Oh, you were talking about a different case.
Oh, yeah,
sorry.
well, the January 6th people.
Yeah, I was
yes,
talking about the January
plus
6th,
actual
1500.
military
That's true,
people
true.
who were adjudicated as being criminals and court-martialed. That is that undermines confidence in the accountability and the very strong civilian control of the military, and the military professionalism is being undermined from the top in many ways. And so, unfortunately, I can imagine many scenarios that the speaker asked about. None of them are good. But these are things that, again, would not have been thinkable several months ago, but now are clearly on the agenda, unfortunately.
All right, well, we've covered the waterfront. There is stuff we never got to. We didn't have a robust conversation about China. We didn't solve the Ukrainian war. There's still a lot to be talked about. I would like to ask you.
This is halftime, isn't it?
Yeah, halftime, yeah. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking these great folks here for participating. As always, for those of you who made the trek to join us here in the auditorium, we've got food and drinks across the way. One slight change from past receptions is if you would like some alcohol, there's going to be a fee for the alcohol, but otherwise it's free food and free other beverages. So please make your way across the hall, give us a chance to get our microphones off and make our way over there before you intercept them here at the auditorium. Thank you very much.